You're listening to When the Lies Began.
We're taking a deep dive today into a case that, well, it hasn't just defined American true crime, it's really warped and shaped the whole genre of modern horror. Yeah, our mission today is to try and excavate the truth, from underneath all the fiction that's built up over the years. We want to follow the actual chronology of Edward Gein's double life. And it was such a meticulously split life. For decades, you had this image, the meek, harmless neighbor in Plainfield, Wisconsin. But secretly, he was hiding this just unimaginable reality. The core truth, I think, the thing that's so shocking about Ed Gein is that contradiction. In fact, he was known as this quiet, middle-aged handyman, the kind of guy people trusted, right? He was even a reliable babysitter in the community.
Exactly. And then November 1957 happens. The discovery at his isolated farm. It didn't just expose a killer. It really shattered that whole illusion of quiet, small-town American life forever.
We really need to understand how that was possible. How did he go from mild-mannered Ed to the butcher of Plainfield? And why did absolutely nobody see it coming? Well, what makes this case so foundational, I think, is its huge cultural impact. It's honestly one of the highest impact criminal cases in American history. It inspired decades of horror fiction films. But because of that, because pop culture adopted him so thoroughly, the lines between documented fact and, the lasting fiction are just constantly blurred.
That's a great point. People think they know the story because they've seen Psycho or Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Right. But the actual reality of Gein's actions, his psychology, it's way more complex and, frankly, specific than what usually makes it onto the screen. So, just a heads up for everyone listening, our journey today, it's going to be sensitive, it's emotionally charged. We're going to move through the initial shock of that discovery in Plainfield.
Then into the suspicion surrounding his early life.
Leading into the terrifying revelation of his secret world. And then finally, we need to take some time for reflection. What's the legacy of this unique kind of evil that was hiding right there in plain sight?
Okay, let's start at the beginning. Let's unpack the timeline of his pathology, really digging into his childhood. Edward Theodore Gein was born August 27, 1906. That was in La Crosse, Wisconsin, fact CT. He was the younger of two boys, Edward and his older brother Henry. Their father, George, well, he was barely a presence. An abusive alcoholic, held down various menial jobs. He died pretty early on, in 1940.
Familiar.
Yeah, George was almost irrelevant in the family dynamic. The real center, the absolute core influence in Ed's life was his mother, Augusta.
And elderly, too. When we say religious, we don't just mean devout.
No, not at all. She was fanatically, rigidly fundamentalist, fact and I. Her belief system was that the entire outside world was just a cesspool of evil. And specifically, that all women apart from herself naturally were vessels of sin. In fact, she relentlessly hammered home this idea that alcohol, sex, any kind of physical pleasure, it was all just instruments of the devil.
Wow. And this wasn't just talk, was it? It actually dictated where they lived. Precisely. In 1914, Ed was 8 years old. Augusta decided La Crosse was, and this is her phrase, a sinkhole of filth. Factly, she insisted they buy and move to this isolated, sprawling 195-acre farm near Plainfield.
An isolated farm.
Extremely isolated.
Yeah.
The move was explicitly designed to keep Ed and Henry away from what she called the immorality of the city. Fact 2. And we can't really overstate that physical isolation. Their closest neighbors were almost a mile away. The boys had basically no one but their parents and each other for company. For a developing child, that's Ada.
Well, it's an immediate severing of normal social development.
And the social isolation, even when he had to go to school, it sounds profound. You mentioned he was painfully shy.
Painfully shy, yes.
Yeah.
He also had a noticeable speech impediment and strabismus, a lazy eye, which, made him an instant target for bullies. Fact, he just couldn't connect with his peers.
Well, it's probably just reinforced everything Augusta was telling him, right? That
Oh.
the outside world was dangerous and wicked. Exactly. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy. And crucially, Ed didn't just accept her worldview, he absolutely adored her. Psychedly. Unlike his older brother Henry, Ed never ever criticized Augusta. He became essentially the perfect receptacle for her twisted morality, absorbed all her harshness constantly, desperately seeking any little crumb of praise or approval she might offer.
In fact, so psychologically, what's the impact of all this rigid, demanding, isolated environment?
Well, it's almost textbook, really. It led to severe social awkwardness, stunted emotional growth. His entire reality was dictated by this single, totally dominating domineering female figure. And this wasn't just childhood, this persisted right into his adulthood. Think about this detail. It seems small, but it's telling. The absolute furthest Ed Gein ever traveled in his entire life was to Milwaukee.
Milwaukee. When was that?
That was in 1942. He was 36. He went for a World War II draft physical. He failed it, actually, because of his eye condition, faxing. But that trip, that was the boundary of his entire existence. Think about that.
That's incredible. So contained.
But maybe the peak, the defining moment of Augustus' control, especially over his psychology, involves this deeply disturbing incident. Faxically, when Ed was about 12 years old, Augusta caught him masturbating in the bathtub. Pathetic. Now, her reaction wasn't just a typical parental telling off. She flew into an absolute rage, physically grabbed his genitals, and immediately branded them the curse of man. Factory just drove home this message that his natural biological urges were fundamentally filthy damned.
Oh my God, that's devastating. That single event, it just encapsulates the intense, crippling control she had over his emerging sexuality.
It really does. You have to imagine what that does to a boy who already sees his mother as this figure of, like, unimpeachable moral authority.
It must have created this huge internal conflict.
A foundational, crippling psychological conflict, absolutely. Theory Augusta basically weaponized shame to control his most fundamental human urges. This intense, controlling relationship, it cemented his total dependence on her. She successfully manipulated him, didn't she? Made him desperately seek her approval, her praise, just to ensure he would never, ever leave her side. Theory,
She became his entire world.
his singular source of psychological and emotional validation, she essentially just swallowed his individual identity whole. Theory, he wasn't just devoted, he was completely trapped. Any natural impulse towards independence, towards normalcy, was just violently suppressed by his own conscience because it was filtered through her rigid, damning doctrine.
Okay, so let's move into the early 1940s, because this is when that structure, the little world Ed lived in, really started to crumble. It began with his father, George, dying in 1940.
Right, and Augusta's reaction was, well, typical Augusta. She immediately blamed his death on his inherent weakness, his alcoholism. She apparently often referred to him as going to hell. Fac si quaesides. No grief, just judgment.
So with George gone, that left Ed and Henry, now young men, to support the farm, right? They started taking odd jobs.
Yeah, they had to. They worked as handymen, did farm work for neighbors, fac et. And this is actually where we start to see the early signs of that double life farming. Because Ed became known in Plainfield, people saw him as a reliable worker, a trustworthy guy. He was even employed pretty often as a babysitter by the few neighbors they had.
Babysitter detail is always so chilling in hindsight.
It really is. But this period also introduced the first major tension in Ed's life that didn't come directly from Augusta, and that was Henry.
His older brother.
Yes. Henry was 5 years older and much more, let's say, socially grounded. He started to openly criticize Augusta. Her intense, suffocating hold over both of them, but especially Ed's unhealthy, absolute attachment to her.
He saw how bad it was.
He did. This was around 1944. Henry wanted Ed to, seek some kind of independence or at least just recognize the damage Augusta was doing.
Fatty, and how did Ed react to that?
For Ed, Henry's criticism wasn't just disagreement. It felt like a profound betrayal, personally and morally. Henry was attacking the only safe, sacred thing in Ed's entire world, his bond with Augusta. It reportedly shocked and mortified him. Fact.
That tension then sets a really grim stage for what happens next, doesn't it? The death of Henry, which sounds highly suspicious.
Extremely suspicious. It was May 16th, 1944. Henry died suddenly. They were fighting a marsh fire together on the property. It's just a relatively small fire, but it got away from them a bit.
Okay.
Ed went to get help, notify the police. But when they returned, he claimed he couldn't find Henry's body. Said he'd lost track of him in the smoke and confusion. But then, just moments later, Ed led the police directly to Henry's body. Fact 2.
Yeah.
Which is odd, right, if you couldn't find him just before.
Very odd. And what about the body itself? What were the key, let's say, investigative failures here?
Well, the facts surrounding the body are highly disturbing. They raise a massive red flag. Henry's body had 0 fire injuries, none at all. Fact, no burns, but he did have bruises on his head. Fact now, the official cause of death was listed as heart failure.
Which I guess could happen during a firefight, the exertion.
It's plausible, yes. Strenuous activity, excitement. It wasn't unheard of, but crucial questions were just ignored. And the single biggest failure. No autopsy was ever performed, despite the suspicious bruising on his head.
No autopsy. That just leaves the door wide open, doesn't it?
Completely. It allowed speculation to start immediately, and frankly, it's persisted for decades. Theory was this Ed's first deliberate act of violence. Many people theorize that Ed may well have killed Henry, maybe struck him during the confusion of the fire. Why? Because of that intense conflict over Augusta, which had clearly reached a boiling point. Theory.
Eliminating the competition in a warped way.
Or eliminating the threat. For Ed, getting rid of the one person challenging that sacred link between him and his mother, it might have felt like a psychological necessity. Maybe not even a consciously planned murder, but an impulsive act. Theory. The fact remains, he was the only witness and the one who both reported him missing and then suddenly located the body. It's profoundly disturbing.
Whether it was murder or a tragic accident, the result was the same for Ed in one way. He lost his brother, and then just over a year later, the final blow.
Yes. Augusta suffered a stroke. She lingered for a bit, but then died in December 1945. Fex. And just like that, Ed was truly, utterly alone on that isolated farm.
He had lost the three people who made up his entire world: his father, his brother, his mother, all within 5 traumatic years. Fact 6.
The effect was, well, catastrophic seems too small a word. It created this profound, unfillable vacancy in his psyche. Theory. You have to remember, Ed was emotionally and psychologically stunted. He simply lacked the maturity, the skills to process that kind of overwhelming grief.
He didn't just miss his mother.
No, he lost his only moral compass, his only source of identity. And that loss, that void, immediately launched him on this desperate, deeply disturbed search. A search for a way to somehow bring his mother back to life, or at least to recreate her presence in some tangible way. Theory.
And his first reaction to that loss seems almost symbolic. The farm fell into disrepair.
For 2 years, yes. The farm just deteriorated, almost like a mirror of his own mental state. Fact A. And then came the really symbolic act. He boarded up all the rooms in the house except for 2, the kitchen and a small bedroom next to it.
But Augusta's room.
Augusta's bedroom and the parlor downstairs, he locked them up, left them completely undisturbed. Pristine, like a shrine. Fact A. And they stayed that way, untouched by him, until the police finally opened them years later after his arrest. It's the ultimate physical manifestation of his refusal, his inability to let go.
Wow. So with no human connection left, what did he do? Where did his mind go?
It turned inward. And he found a substitute of sorts for human reality. He shifted his focus entirely to reading. Fact D4. But it's what he started reading that tells us everything about the incredibly dark path his mind was taking. This became his new twisted curriculum.
Okay, what kind of books are we talking about?
He devoured literature on Nazi atrocities.
Yeah.
Fact T, specifically, he seemed fascinated by the acts of Ilse Koch, the so-called bitch of Buchenwald.
Ilse Koch, the one infamous for making things out of prisoners' skin.
That's the one. Trophies from the skin of tattooed prisoners, lampshades, things like that. Fact T. Alongside that, he spent countless hours reading lurid accounts of South Seas cannibals and headhunters. He developed this really macabre interest in the process of shrinking heads.
So, violence, trophies.
And anatomy. Layered on top of all that was extensive reading of anatomy books, fact T medical texts, basically.
What strikes me here is that it wasn't just generic true crime or horror. It sounds like he was interested in the process.
Exactly. It was procedural. He wasn't just fascinated by death itself. He was obsessed with the mechanics of repurposing the human body, specifically how to turn human remains into trophies, or even, domestic objects.
Which is just chillingly practical in its own way.
Precisely. This macabre literature became the dark foundation, the blueprint for the secret world he was about to build. Theory Ilse Koch's actions gave him the idea. The human body could be disassembled, used for furniture, decorations, clothing. The headhunting stuff gave him the mechanics of decapitation, trophy preparation. This wasn't entertainment for him. It was research. It was preparation for the acts he would soon undertake. He was turning his grief, his loss, into this literal, physical, and utterly grotesque construction project, aimed squarely at resurrecting or at least replacing Augusta.
So now we're moving into the phase where this dark fantasy starts bleeding into reality. It's about 18 months after Augusta died, right? Around 1947. Gein's 41 years old.
Yes. And driven by this intense loneliness, combined with, he described strange visions and impulses. He began his nocturnal visits to the local cemeteries.
What was he doing there initially?
Scouting. He started reading the obituaries, looking specifically for newly buried middle-aged women who, in his mind, resembled his late mother. Fact 2.
Okay. And then the grave violations began.
Over the next 4 years, roughly 1947 to 1951, he eventually confessed to violating 9 separate graves. Fact T. But And this is important, he also claimed to have visited up to 40 different cemeteries, often arriving, looking around, and then leaving without actually disturbing anything. Facty.
So a lot of planning, a lot of scouting went into this. It wasn't impulsive.
Not at all. It's just meticulous planning. When he did violate a grave, the process was methodical. He'd exhume the body, remove specific parts, sometimes whole bodies, sometimes just sections. Then he would painstakingly recover the grave, fill it back in, replace the sod, make it look undisturbed. Then he'd return home with his morbid cargo, facti.
And the motive. Why was he doing this?
This is critical because it really pushes back against the simplistic Hollywood versions. Gein himself confirmed quite clearly that he was seeking a remembrance of his mother. Fact, that was his primary stated goal.
Was there a sexual element? He was asked about that, wasn't he?
He was asked explicitly about having sexual relations with the cadavers. He denied it, famously stating that they smelled too bad. Fact. Which is a bizarrely practical reason, isn't it?
It is. But did he concede anything about necrophilia?
He did. Right after denying the sexual act, he immediately conceded that his actions did fit the category of necrophilia. Why? Because he admitted feeling tremendous excitement during the grave robberies. Fact. And even more strangely, he admitted to trying to arouse the dead. Not physically, but by an act of sheer willpower. Fact. Trying to mentally will them back to life or responsiveness.
Wow, so it's not simple sexual pathology.
No, it's far more complex. It looks like a profound, almost ritualistic attempt to conquer death, conquer his grief, but all filtered through that crippling sexual repression Augusta instilled in him. He wasn't trying to satisfy a physical urge. He was trying to resurrect an ideal, the ideal of his mother.
The meticulousness, though, the planning, the careful resealing of the graves.
Yeah.
It's chilling. This isn't chaotic. It's controlled.
Absolutely controlled. Intense, sustained secrecy. And that secrecy allowed him to live his apparently normal life completely unnoticed, while in the background, a disturbing cluster of disappearances started plaguing the area.
What disappearances are we talking about?
Well, in 1947, the same year he likely started the grave robbing, an 8-year-old girl named Georgia Weckler disappeared. Fact then, in October 1953, a 15-year-old girl, Evelyn Hartley, was abducted while she was babysitting.
Fact big.
And Gein was never conclusively linked to those. Never conclusively, no. But the timing is disturbing, and the fact remains. During this exact period, Ed Gein was known in the community, trusted by neighbors, as a reliable babysitter. Factually, it just adds this excruciating layer to the lie of his double life.
So this grave robbing period,
Yeah.
it was almost like his apprenticeship in dealing with bodies.
You could see it that way, yes.
Yeah.
Learning the mechanics, perhaps desensitizing himself, because the first known homicide that we can directly link to him came 3 years after that period ended, in December 1954.
And that was Mary Hogan.
Mary Hogan, yes. A 54-year-old tavern owner in the nearby town of Pine Grove. She vanished from her tavern, Fexty.
And Ed Gein was known to be a regular customer there.
Why Mary Hogan? Was there a connection to his mother again?
There was, but it was a complicated one. Mary Hogan apparently physically resembled Augusta. Back then, but then this is key, she represented everything Augusta despised. She owned a tavern, she had what Gein described as a foul mouth and trashy history. Fact.
So the resemblance was there, but the character was the opposite, the sacred figure embodying the profane. Exactly, and that contradiction seems to have absolutely transfixed him. It's like his psychological need to control, maybe even eliminate, the vessel of sin finally took physical form. It wasn't enough anymore to just dig up anonymous women who looked like Mom. He needed to kill a specific woman who represented that duality that tormented him.
And then he joked about it.
This is one of the most surreal details. After Mary Hogan vanished, Gein actually started joking to neighbors, saying things like Mary was up at the house now.
Fact.
He basically told them.
He was literally telling people the truth, or at least a horrifically morbid version of it. But his mask, that mild-mannered, quiet, harmless Ed mask,
Yeah.
it was so absolute, so convincing, that the community just dismissed it. They thought it was just Ed being crude, making a weird, local, harmless joke.
The man they trusted to watch their kids couldn't possibly mean it. Couldn't possibly. That mask held firm. Despite the growing list of missing people in the area, despite his own careless joke. It wasn't until much later, after his arrest, that police ballistics confirmed that Gein's Mauser pistol was indeed the weapon used to kill Mary Hogan. Fact CT.
So the facade held for another few years after Mary Hogan, but then came November 1957.
Yeah.
The dam finally broke.
Yes. The final victim, Bernice Worden, 58 years old. Fact CT. By all accounts, she was a well-liked widow, an outstanding citizen in Plainfield. She owned the local hardware store, and she disappeared from that store on November 16th, 1957.
Fact, CT.
But this time, unlike with Mary Hogan, there was an immediate clue, wasn't there? A crucial, undeniable clue. Fact CT, Bernice's son, Frank Worden, happened to be a deputy sheriff. When he got to the store after his mother went missing, he found the cash register gone, yes, but he also found blood on the floor. A misplaced .22 caliber rifle near the counter. And critically, a sales receipt made out for a gallon of antifreeze. To Eddie Gein. Facting. And Frank remembered Gein had been in the store the day before asking about antifreeze. It gave him both a timeline and a reason for Gein to be at the store that morning.
So suspicion fell on Gein immediately this time.
Instantly. The town's focus locked onto Ed. The manhunt was swift. They found him and apprehended him that very evening, actually at a neighbor's house where he'd gone for dinner.
And the deputy who arrested him, he took precautions.
Deputy Chase did, yes. He recognized the mood in the town, the fear, the potential for violence if people knew who they had. So during the drive to the station, he actually had Gein lie down on the floor of the patrol car out of sight.
Trying to protect him from mob justice.
Exactly. But what's genuinely shocking and maybe revealing is Gein's reaction to this. He was reportedly greatly amused by this precaution. Fact A, he found the deputy's fear of the townspeople's reaction entertaining.
That suggests such a profound detachment, doesn't it?
It really does. Like, he was already living entirely outside the normal bounds of human reality, watching this drama unfold around him almost like a spectator, not emotionally involved at all.
So Gein's in custody. The next day, November 17th, 1957, Sheriff Schley and Deputy Frank Worden, Bernice's son, they go out to execute the search warrant at the farm.
Faxi.
Yes.
Huh?
They head out to that isolated, decaying farmhouse. They know they're looking for evidence connected to Bernice's disappearance, maybe evidence of a struggle, maybe the missing cash register.
But they were completely unprepared for what they were actually about to find.
Completely. The moment of discovery, it's frankly one of the single most horrific moments in the annals of American true crime. Tactic Katie entered the house through the summer kitchen and then moved into an attached shed. And Deputy Worden, Bernice's own son, saw something hanging in the dim light. He cried out, "My God, here she is."
Oh, no.
Bernice Worden's body was hanging upside down from the rafters.
Yeah.
Saxady suspended by ropes tied around her ankles. She was nude and completely headless.
Yes, and worse. She had been, well, the phrase used was completely dressed out like a deer. Fact, meaning she'd been gutted. A long median incision ran from her sternum all the way down to her vagina.
Oh, God.
Her body had been meticulously opened up. The internal organs had been removed, including the vulva, which they later found preserved separately, in a box. This wasn't some quick crime of passion. This was deliberate, planned, butchery, disassembly. Drawing directly from all those anatomy books and trophy collection counts he'd been reading for years, the full horror was finally revealed.
Okay, that horrifying discovery leads us straight into the next part.
Yeah.
The absolutely sickening inventory of items police recovered from inside that farmhouse.
Right. The house itself was, as you'd expect, a complete disaster zone. The reports described it as an incredible chaos of trash and garbage. Just squalor everywhere. But hidden beneath, or maybe within that squalor, was the physical manifestation of Ed Gein's entire secret life. A collection of domestic items fashioned entirely from human remains.
In fact, it's almost impossible to comprehend. What kind of items are we talking about?
The shock was absolute for the officers on scene. And the list, it really defies belief. Gein had literally repurposed human remains into furniture and decor, echoing those procedures he'd studied, like with Ilse Koch. They found chairs, upholstered in human skin.
Chairs, upholstered in skin.
Yes, actual chairs. They found a wastepaper basket made of skin, a lampshade crafted from a human face, even pull cords for window shades tipped with human lips, and bowls. Bowls made from inverted human skull caps used for everyday things.
But sheer audacity isn't the right word. The profound desecration of using human skin and bones for household items. It just transforms this from murder into something else entirely. It's like a horror movie trope made horrifyingly real.
It truly is. And his collections went beyond just decor into actual gruesome trophies and clothing. Skulls were found affixed to the posts of his bed, fexiti, like morbid bed knobs.
Oh my God.
Police also found a box. Inside were preserved female organs, exiti, and one of these organs, horrifyingly, had been gilded, painted gold, and had a red ribbon tied around it. Fexiti.
Gilded. With a ribbon. That doesn't suggest practical storage. That sounds like reverence, a trophy.
Like a morbid, perverse treasure, exactly. And moving on to the clothing and other artifacts, They discovered a belt made from female nipples strung together.
A belt of nipples.
Yes, and perhaps most famously, most disturbingly, an entire suit made of women's skin. In fact, this wasn't just a mask, it was a torso, leggings, meticulously pieced together from the skin of different corpses, complete with breasts attached.
And made a woman's suit.
He did, suggesting this disturbing effort to literally wear or inhabit the form of a woman. It wasn't just a mask to hide behind. It seems like an attempt at psychological transformation, or maybe, in his mind, a literal resurrection of that mother figure he'd lost.
The creation of that suit, specifically, feels like it reveals so much about his driving pathology. It wasn't enough to just possess the parts. He had to assemble them into a functional representation of the female form.
I think it speaks directly to that psychological void Augusta's death created. He wasn't just trying to remember her, he was trying to become her, or at least recreate the physical essence of that female dominance he had depended on his entire life. Theory. The suit was this horrific, Frankensteinian attempt to solve the trauma of his isolation, allowing him to symbolically, maybe even literally in his mind, inhabit the power structure he needed.
So where did all this material come from? He confessed to the murders of Worden and Hogan, but this inventory sounds vast.
It was vast. During his interrogation, Gein claimed that the vast majority of the grotesque inventory, the bowls, the lampshades, the skin suit, came not from murder victims, but from the 9 graves he admitted to robbing between 1947 and 1951.
He maintained most of it was grave goods.
That was his claim. But the numbers, they don't entirely align. And that raises that lingering suspicion. Were there more victims than just Worden and Hogan?
How so?
Well, police ultimately found 12 human heads, or partial heads masks, on the property. FCT. Now, if you count Worden and Hogan, plus the 9 admitted grave robberies, that only accounts for 11 bodies. Where did the 12th head come from? Or were there even more grave robberies he didn't admit to?
Right. The math doesn't quite add up.
It doesn't. Gein was clearly meticulous about decapitation. He confessed quite clinically to removing Bernice Worden's head by twisting and snapping the neck bone, FCT. And they found one head preserved in a plastic bag that Seraph Wanzerski strongly believed resembled Mary Hogan. FCT, the rest of the inventory Gein insisted was just from the graves, highlighting, if true, his incredible proficiency at grave robbing that went completely undetected for years.
What's so fascinating in a horrible way about this inventory is the contrast it presents. On one hand, you have this detailed, methodical work butchering, sewing skin, crafting items requiring patience, dexterity, complex motor skills. But on the other hand, Gein was consistently portrayed by neighbors as this simple, almost slow-witted, harmless handyman. How do we reconcile those two images?
I think we reconcile it by understanding that his focus was absolute. He might have been awkward, maybe struggled socially, maybe seemed simple in everyday interactions. But when it came to the work of his secret world, the grave robbing, the crafting, he was utterly focused, capable of immense, sustained, meticulous effort. Think about the precision needed for the grave recoveries, making them look undisturbed, the detailed cutting and sewing required for the skin suit, the careful gilding of that organ. This points to a man whose entire energy, whose entire intellect was channeled into this single, highly specific, morbid pursuit. The lie of the harmless handyman wasn't just passive. It was an active deception, honed and fueled by years of undisturbed practice in secret.
Okay, let's move into the final part, the legal consequences and the incredible, enduring cultural impact of Ed Gein. So after the arrest, during the initial interrogations, he admitted to the killings.
He did admit to killing Worden and Hogan, yes, but almost immediately he tried to shift the blame, to justify his actions in a really twisted way.
How did he do that?
He started characterizing his victims, particularly Mrs. Worden, who everyone knew as this outstanding citizen. He characterized her as somehow bad or immoral. Fact, despite having absolutely zero evidence to support that claim.
So blaming the victim.
Completely. It reveals his core paranoid worldview, doesn't it? The one instilled by Augusta. Women are inherently evil, vessels of sin. He couldn't face the moral reality of his own horrific actions, so he had to create this narrative where they were bad, and maybe he was some kind of righteous, if morbid, agent cleaning things up. It's classic perpetrator justification.
The legal proceedings themselves sound like they were pretty complicated, partly because of his obvious mental state, but also because of how the police handled the interrogations.
Absolutely. It was complex. Gunn was initially found mentally unfit to stand trial. He was committed to a state hospital for the criminally insane. But years later, in 1968, he was deemed fit to stand trial. Fact.
And the verdict.
He was found guilty of first-degree murder for the death of Bernice Worden. But, and this is the crucial part, legally, He was also found not guilty by reason of insanity at the time of the murder, Saxatio. So instead of prison, he was committed back to Central State Hospital where he spent the rest of his life.
Why the insanity finding? Was it just the nature of the crimes?
That was certainly part of it, the sheer bizarre horror. But another issue that plagued the case was Gein's suggestibility. Fact-deep observers noted he was extremely suggestible during questioning. He would often just readily agree to leading questions from the interrogator.
Which complicates the confessions, right?
Significantly. It made it hard to know what was genuinely his memory and what was him just agreeing with what the police were suggesting. In fact, the trial judge, Judge Gulmar, ultimately suppressed Gein's full confession. Why? Because of improper interrogation methods.
Improper how?
Specifically, the judge noted testimony that Sheriff Schley had physically shoved Gein against a concrete wall during the initial interrogation. That raised serious questions about coercion, about whether the confession was truly voluntary.
Fact. That point about suggestibility and potential coercion is really key, isn't it? Especially for anyone trying to understand the case accurately. It forces you to ask, did the police, in their understandable need for answers, maybe shape or even inflate the scope of his crimes in his confession?
Or was Gein maybe using his apparent suggestibility as another kind of psychological shield, another layer of deception?
They could be both.
Given his documented history of intense focus when he wanted something and his meticulous deception over years, it's highly likely it was a combination of both. Gein clearly found some kind of amusement or maybe validation in the attention he was receiving. He seemed eager to please authority figures, even if it meant agreeing with their phrasing. But at the end of the day, the material evidence, the inventory in the house, the bodies themselves spoke volumes. The potentially coerced confession simply added a layer of legal complexity to an already unbelievably insane situation.
And what happened to Gein in the end?
The physical timeline of Ed Gein's life ended pretty quietly, actually. He spent decades institutionalized. He eventually died of complications from lung cancer and respiratory illnesses on July 26, 1984. He was 77 years old.
And where was he buried?
In a final, almost unbearably grim irony, he was buried right next to his mother, Augusta, in the Plainfield Cemetery. In fact, the very place he had spent years secretly desecrating under the cover of darkness.
Wow. So his physical life ended, but his cultural life, that seems to have achieved a kind of immortality.
Oh, absolutely. Gein's crimes didn't just shock America. They fundamentally changed something. They created, really, the quintessentially American figure of horror. Reflection. That figure of the ordinary, friendly, quiet neighbor who is secretly a terrifying monster operating completely undetected right next door.
He basically provided the blueprint for the entire modern psycho-killer genre in fiction and film, didn't he? In fact, let's trace some of those direct lines. Norman Bates in Psycho is the obvious first one.
The parallels are undeniable. Both men totally governed by these strict moral constraints enforced by intensely dominating mothers. Bates was so crippled by his devotion he literally preserved his mother's corpse. Gein was driven to recreate her physical essence using female body parts. At the core psychological void, that overwhelming dependence on the mother figure, it's identical. Just the manifestation differs slightly.
And then there's the visual horror, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
The entire aesthetic of Leatherface in that film is a direct lift from the Gein farmhouse inventory. Faxi Leatherface wears masks made of human skin. He engages in cannibalism, trophy collecting. It directly borrows the element of using human skin for clothing, for masks, for domestic items, straight from the real-life horrors found at Gein's farm.
Even decades later, the influence kept going. The Silence of the Lambs, Buffalo Bill.
Another clear parallel. Faxi Buffalo Bill traps his victims specifically to harvest their skin. Why? To complete his girl suit. It's a literal recreation of Gein's ambition to wear female skin, trying to solve his own profound issues of identity and gender through this grotesque act.
It all seems to come back to the effectiveness of that mask, doesn't it? The mask of normalcy.
It really does. Here was a man who murdered at least 2 women, admitted to robbing 9 graves, possibly more, manufactured household items from human remains, yet his community consistently trusted him as a dependable handyman, as a babysitter. The sheer dissonance is just staggering.
So the final chilling thought, maybe, isn't just about the crimes themselves. The ultimate lie was, perhaps, those decades of apparent harmlessness, the absolute competence he showed in maintaining that hidden, macabre reality right under everyone's noses.
And if that man, the man who inspired some of the darkest figures in modern horror cinema, could be trusted so implicitly by his entire community, What does that teach us, really, about the true nature of evil? How easily it can hide in plain sight? What seemingly harmless double life, capable of sustained, unimaginable secrecy, might be being lived just down the street from you right now?